The blood on Victoria Thorne's hands belonged to a man who did not deserve her mercy. But she had given it to him anyway, nursing him through fever while the entire saloon whispered that she was a fool. That was 3 years ago, back when she still believed kindness could redeem a person, back when she thought maybe her profession did not define the entirety of her soul. Now, standing behind the polished mahogany bar of the Silver Spur Saloon in Raton, New Mexico, she poured whiskey for miners and drifters and told herself that hope was a luxury women like her could not afford. The year was 1882, and the railroad had brought prosperity to this mountain town, nestled where the Santa Fe Trail crossed into the territory. But it had also brought men with more money than morals, men who looked at her with eyes that saw only what they wanted to see. She was 24 years old, and she had been working in saloons since she was 18, when her father's gambling debts had fallen on her shoulders like a yoke she could not shake. Her mother had died when Victoria was 15, consumption taking her slowly, painfully, and her father had followed 3 years later, a bullet in a card game gone wrong. She had tried to find respectable work, truly she had, but the general store would not hire her. The hotel said they had no positions, and the seamstress had looked at her with such pity that Victoria had walked out before the woman could finish her sentence. So she had gone to the saloon, where at least they were honest about what they wanted from her. She served drinks. She sang sometimes when the piano player was sober enough to accompany her. And yes, she entertained men in the rooms upstairs when the rent was due, and her conscience was quiet enough to allow it. The door swung open, letting in a gust of cool September air that smelled of pine and approaching autumn. Victoria glanced up from the glass she was polishing and felt something shift in her chest, though she could not have said why. The man who walked in was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of slate after rain. He wore dusty traveling clothes, a brown leather vest over a chambray shirt, and his gun belt sat low on his hips in the manner of someone who knew how to use it but did not feel the need to prove anything. He moved with a quiet confidence that made the other men in the saloon seem suddenly loud and graceless by comparison. He walked directly to the bar, his boots making soft sounds on the sawdust-covered floor, and when he looked at Victoria, she felt the strangest sensation, as though he was seeing her, truly seeing her, not just the low-cut dress and the paint on her lips. "Whiskey, please," he said, and his voice was low, courteous, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or perhaps Oklahoma territory. Victoria poured the drink with steady hands, though her heart was beating faster than it should. "Passing through or staying?" she asked, because that was what you asked strangers in a town like Raton, where the railroad brought new faces every day. "Staying, I reckon," he said, taking the glass but not drinking immediately. "I am looking for work. Heard there might be ranches hiring hands before winter sets in." "The Double R might be looking," Victoria said, naming the largest cattle operation in the area. "They lost some men to the silver mines up in Colorado. Better pay for less work, or so they say." The man nodded thoughtfully, then extended his hand across the bar. "Name is Preston Lang." "Pleased to make your acquaintance, miss." She hesitated, her hand hovering in the air between them. Men did not usually offer to shake her hand. They winked, they leered, they sometimes grabbed, but they did not treat her like a lady worthy of proper introduction. "Victoria Thorne," she said finally, placing her hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle, his palm calloused from hard work, and he released her hand after an appropriate moment, not holding on too long like so many men did, as though touching her gave them some kind of claim. "Pretty name," Preston said, and it did not sound like a line, just a simple observation. He took a sip of his whiskey, then glanced around the saloon. "Seems like a decent enough town." "It has its moments," Victoria said, and there was more bitterness in her voice than she had intended. She turned away to serve another customer, but she could feel Preston's eyes on her, not in the way that made her skin crawl, but in a way that made her curious and uncomfortable in equal measure. The evening progressed, as evenings in the Silver Spur always did. The piano player, a man named Charlie with more enthusiasm than talent, pounded out familiar tunes while men played cards and argued about politics and mining claims. Victoria moved through the crowd with practiced ease, deflecting unwanted advances with a smile and a joke, pouring drinks, collecting money. Preston Lang stayed at the bar, nursing his whiskey and watching the room with the quiet alertness of a man who had learned to assess danger before it arrived. Around 9 o'clock, trouble walked through the door in the form of Jack Brennan and his two brothers. The Brennans owned a small ranch east of town and had a reputation for meanness that they seemed to cultivate deliberately. Jack was the worst of them, a bull of a man with a red face and hands like ham hocks. He had been pestering Victoria for months, convinced that enough money would eventually buy her affection, or at least her compliance. She had turned him down more times than she could count, but he kept coming back, each time a little drunker, a little angrier. "There is my favorite girl," Jack announced loudly, crossing the room toward Victoria with his brothers flanking him like loyal dogs. "Come sit with us, Vicky. We got money to spend and the whole night ahead of us." Victoria kept her expression neutral, though her stomach tightened with familiar dread. "I am working, Jack. Maybe later." It was the same thing she always said, a polite fiction that kept things civil. "Now you are being unfriendly," Jack said, reaching the bar and leaning against it heavily. His breath reeked of whiskey, suggesting he had been drinking before he arrived. "A man might think you do not like him." "A man might be right," Victoria said, her voice light but her eyes hard. "Now, what can I get you boys to drink?" Jack's face darkened and he reached across the bar, his thick fingers closing around Victoria's wrist. "I am tired of your high and mighty act," he said, his voice dropping to something ugly. "You spread your legs for half the men in this town, but you act like you are too good for me." Victoria tried to pull her arm free, but his grip was like iron. "Let me go, Jack," she said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her throat. The saloon had gone quiet, the way it always did when violence was about to erupt, everyone watching but no one intervening because Jack Brennan was the kind of man people were afraid to cross. "I think the lady asked you to let go." Preston Lang's voice cut through the tension, calm but carrying a note of steel that made Jack's head snap around. Preston had stood from his stool and taken 3 steps closer, his hand resting casually near his gun belt. "This does not concern you, stranger," Jack said, but he released Victoria's wrist. "This is between me and the girl." "The lady," Preston corrected quietly. "And it became my concern when you put your hands on her against her will." Jack's brothers had moved to flank Preston now, forming a rough triangle, and Victoria's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Preston, it is fine," she said quickly, because the last thing she wanted was for this stranger, this man who had looked at her like she was a person, to get hurt on her account. "It is not fine," Preston said, his eyes never leaving Jack. "You owe the lady an apology." For a moment, Victoria thought Jack might actually swing at Preston. His face was purple with rage, his fists clenched at his sides. But something in Preston's stance, in the absolute calm of his expression, made Jack reconsider. He was a bully, and bullies were essentially cowards who only picked fights they knew they could win. Whatever Jack saw in Preston Lang made him uncertain, and uncertainty made him back down. "She is not worth the trouble anyway," Jack spat, then turned and stormed out of the saloon, his brothers following after a brief hesitation. The door slammed behind them, and slowly the noise in the room resumed, conversations picking up as though nothing had happened. Victoria realized she was shaking. She gripped the edge of the bar, taking deep breaths, trying to calm the adrenaline that was surging through her body. Preston returned to his stool, his expression concerned. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "You should not have done that," Victoria said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Jack Brennan is not a man to cross. He holds grudges, and he has friends who are just as mean as he is." "Maybe so," Preston said, "but that does not give him the right to put his hands on you." Victoria looked at him, this stranger who had stepped in when no one else would, and felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, refusing to cry in front of the entire saloon. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But really, I can handle men like Jack. I have been doing it for years." "I do not doubt that," Preston said, "but you should not have to." Those simple words, spoken with such sincerity, broke something loose inside Victoria. She turned away quickly, busying herself with rearranging bottles on the back shelf, because if she looked at him for another second, she was going to start crying, and she could not afford to show that kind of weakness. Not here. Not now. The rest of the evening passed without incident. Preston stayed until closing time, nursing a single glass of whiskey and reading a newspaper someone had left behind. When Victoria finally announced last call, he was one of the last to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at her. "Where might I find a room for the night?" he asked. "Fletcher's boarding house, 2 streets over," Victoria said, pointing. "Mrs. Fletcher is fair with her prices and her rooms are clean." "Much obliged," Preston said, tipping his hat to her. Then he was gone, disappearing into the dark New Mexico night, and Victoria was left with the familiar task of cleaning up after everyone else's good time. She swept the floors, wiped down the tables, counted the till. The saloon owner, a man named Silas Morrow, took his cut and left her with her wages for the night. It was not much, but it was enough to keep her in the small room she rented above the general store, and to put a little aside for the future she kept telling herself would come, even though she had no idea what shape that future might take. As she walked home through the quiet streets, the weight of the evening settled on her shoulders like a physical thing. Jack Brennan would not forget what had happened tonight. He would stew on it, his anger and humiliation fermenting into something more dangerous. And Preston Lang, this cowboy who had defended her honor like she was some kind of storybook heroine, had no idea what he had walked into. She should warn him, she thought. She should find him tomorrow and tell him to ride on, to find work somewhere else, because staying in Raton would only bring him trouble. But even as she thought it, she knew she would not. Because for the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen something worth defending, and she was selfish enough to want to hold onto that feeling for just a little while longer. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the September air carrying the promise of the winter that would soon descend from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that loomed to the west. Victoria woke early, as she always did, and made her way to the small restaurant on Main Street where she usually took her breakfast. She was halfway through her eggs and coffee when Preston Lang walked in, looking refreshed despite what must have been a late night. He spotted her immediately and, after ordering his own breakfast at the counter, asked, "May I join you?" Victoria nodded, surprised and pleased in equal measure. Preston sat down across from her, his long legs folding awkwardly under the small table. "Sleep well." Victoria asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Well enough, Preston said. Mrs. Fletcher runs a tight ship. Clean sheets, no bedbugs, and she makes a fine breakfast. I have stayed in worse places, that is for certain. They ate in companionable silence for a few moments. Then Preston said, I am heading out to the Double R today to ask about work. Would you happen to know who I should ask for? Talk to Raymond Lawson, Victoria said. He is the foreman. Fair man, good judge of character. If you can ride and rope and you are not afraid of hard work, he will probably hire you. Preston nodded thoughtfully. And what about you? What will you be doing today? The question was so normal, so ordinary, as though they were just two people making conversation over breakfast. Victoria was not used to men asking about her day unless they wanted to schedule time with her later. Washing, mending, she said. Boring things. I do not go into the saloon until late afternoon. Nothing wrong with boring, Preston said with a slight smile. Boring keeps you alive a lot longer than exciting, in my experience. Victoria found herself smiling back. You sound like you have done your share of exciting. More than my share, probably, Preston admitted. I was a lawman for a while down in Texas. Deputy in a town not much bigger than this one. Wore a badge for 3 years before I realized I was not cut out for it. Why not? Victoria asked, genuinely curious. Preston was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Too much gray, he said finally. I kept running into situations where the law said one thing, but the right thing was something else entirely. Made me question what I was doing, whether the badge I wore meant anything if I did not believe in the rules it represented. So I turned it in and drifted for a while. Worked cattle drives, hired on as a ranch hand here and there. Ended up here because the railroad conductor said Raton was a good town with good people, and I figured that was as good a recommendation as any. And is it? Victoria asked. A good town with good people. Preston looked at her directly, his gray eyes serious. I have met at least one good person, he said quietly. So I would say the conductor was at least partly right. Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks, and she looked down at her plate, suddenly flustered. You do not know me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You do not know what I am, what I have done. I know what I saw last night, Preston said. I saw a woman trying to do her job being harassed by a man who thought he could take what he wanted. I saw someone who is strong and brave and kinder than she has any reason to be, given how this town probably treats her. Preston. Victoria started, but she did not know how to finish. How could she explain to him that his good opinion, his respect, was based on an incomplete picture? That she was not the lady he seemed to think she was? I should let you finish your breakfast, Preston said, standing and dropping some coins on the table to cover his meal. Thank you for the company, Miss Thorne, and for the information about the Double R. He left before she could respond, and Victoria sat there with her cooling coffee, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet in some fundamental way. She barely knew this man, this cowboy with his quiet strength and his kind eyes, but already she could feel herself starting to hope, and hope was the most dangerous thing in the world for someone like her. Preston got the job at the Double R, as Victoria had known he would. Raymond Lawson recognized competence when he saw it, and Preston was competent in the way that only came from years of hard experience. The ranch was a sprawling operation covering thousands of acres of grassland and scrub, running cattle that would be driven to the railhead in Raton for shipment to the stockyards in Kansas City. It was good work, honest work, and Preston threw himself into it with the dedication of a man grateful for a fresh start. But every evening when his work was done, and the other ranch hands headed to their bunkhouse to play cards or sleep off the day's exhaustion, Preston rode the 6 miles back into town. He told himself it was because he preferred a real bed to a bunk, preferred privacy to the constant company of men who snored and cursed and never stopped talking. But the truth, which he acknowledged only in the privacy of his own thoughts, was that he rode back to town because Victoria Thorne was there, and he found himself unable to stay away. He became a regular fixture at the Silver Spur, always at the same stool at the end of the bar, always polite, always nursing a single whiskey through the evening. He never asked Victoria to sit with him, never propositioned her, never treated her with anything but the utmost respect. And slowly, over the course of weeks, they began to talk. Real talk, not the flirtatious banter that Victoria used with other customers, but honest conversations about their lives, their pasts, their hopes and fears. Preston told her about growing up on a small farm in Texas, the son of a widowed mother who had worked herself to an early grave, trying to keep the land that had been her husband's dream. He told her about his years as a deputy, about the men he had arrested and the few he had been forced to shoot, and how each death had taken a piece of his soul he was not sure he would ever get back. He told her about drifting, about the loneliness of being always in motion, never settling, never belonging anywhere or to anyone. Victoria listened, and slowly, carefully, she began to share her own story. She told him about her parents, about her father's gambling and her mother's illness, about the impossible weight of expectations, and the limited choices available to a woman alone in the world. She told him about the first time a man had offered her money, about how she had said no at first, then yes when the rent came due and her cupboards were empty. She told him about the shame that had nearly consumed her, and about the gradual hardening that had allowed her to survive, to keep going day after day in a world that labeled her as something less than respectable. "You ever think about leaving?" Preston asked one night in early October. The saloon was quieter than usual, a slow Tuesday with more empty tables than full ones. "All the time," Victoria admitted. "But leaving requires money and a destination and some kind of plan for what comes next. I have been saving what I can, but it is not much. And I do not know where I would go, or what I would do when I got there. It is not as though I can put saloon girl on a resume for respectable employment." "You could do anything you wanted," Preston said with such conviction that Victoria almost believed him. "You are smart, you are good with people, you work harder than anyone I know. Any business would be lucky to have you." "That is not how the world works," Victoria said gently. "Women like me do not get second chances. We do not get to reinvent ourselves. We are marked permanently by the choices we have made or that have been made for us." Preston leaned forward, his expression intense. "What if you did not have to do it alone?" he asked. "What if someone was willing to stand beside you to help you make a fresh start?" Victoria's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to shake her head. "Preston, you do not know what you are saying. You have a job now, a good job. You have a reputation as a decent, honorable man. Associating with me will only tarnish that. People already talk because you spend so much time here." "Let them talk," Preston said flatly. "I do not give a damn what people say." "You should," Victoria said urgently. "You should care because this is where you have to live, where you have to work. I am not worth losing all of that." Preston reached across the bar and took her hand, his grip warm and solid and impossibly comforting. "Victoria," he said quietly, "you are worth everything, and I wish I could make you see that." Victoria pulled her hand away, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. "I need to work," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Please, Preston, just let this be." But Preston did not let it be. He kept coming back night after night, a constant, steady presence in her chaotic world. And despite her best efforts to maintain distance, Victoria found herself falling for him with an inevitability that terrified her. She fell for his kindness, for his quiet strength, for the way he looked at her like she hung the moon and stars. She fell for his laugh, rare but genuine, and for the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She fell for his hands, rough from work but gentle when they touched her, and for his voice, low and soothing, talking her through her doubts and fears. She fell in love, and it was the most wonderful and most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her. The trouble she had been expecting from Jack Brennan finally arrived in late October. Victoria was walking home from the saloon, later than usual because Silas had needed her to do inventory. The streets were dark and empty, and she was tired, her feet aching from hours of standing. She did not hear the footsteps behind her until it was too late. Jack grabbed her from behind, one meaty arm wrapping around her waist, the other hand clamping over her mouth before she could scream. He dragged her into the alley between the feed store and the telegraph office, and Victoria fought with every ounce of strength she had, kicking and clawing, trying to bite the hand over her mouth. "You think you are too good for me," Jack hissed in her ear, his breath hot and sour with whiskey. "You and your cowboy both think you can embarrass me in front of the whole town. I am going to teach you a lesson about respect, Vicky. I am going to teach you real good." Terror gave Victoria strength she did not know she possessed. She managed to wrench one arm free and raked her nails down Jack's face, drawing blood. He howled and loosened his grip just enough for Victoria to tear away from him. She ran, her skirts tangling around her legs, her breath coming in panicked gasps. She could hear Jack behind her, cursing, his heavy footsteps pounding on the packed dirt. She did not make a conscious decision about where to go. Her feet simply carried her toward Fletcher's boarding house, toward safety, toward Preston. She flew up the porch steps and pounded on the door, sobbing now, barely able to breathe. Mrs. Fletcher opened the door in her nightgown and robe, took one look at Victoria's terrified face, and immediately called for Preston. He came down the stairs so fast Victoria thought he might fall, his shirt unbuttoned, his feet bare, his hair standing on end from sleep. When he saw her, something dangerous flashed in his eyes, something that reminded Victoria that he had been a lawman once, that he had faced down men far worse than Jack Brennan and lived to tell about it. "What happened?" he demanded, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Victoria, tell me what happened." "Jack Brennan," she managed to say through her sobs. "He grabbed me. I got away, but Preston, he was going to." She could not finish the sentence, could not give voice to the horror that had almost happened. Preston's jaw clenched so hard Victoria could hear his teeth grind. "Stay here," he said, his voice flat and cold in a way she had never heard before. "Mrs. Fletcher, lock the doors after I leave. Do not open them for anyone except me or the sheriff." "Preston, wait," Victoria said, grabbing his arm. "Do not go after him. He is not worth it. Please just stay here with me." Preston looked down at her, and some of the coldness left his expression, replaced by something tender and fierce. "He tried to hurt you," he said simply. "I cannot let that stand." "If you go after him, someone is going to get hurt," Victoria said desperately. "Maybe even killed. I could not bear it if something happened to you because of me." "Nothing is going to happen to me," Preston said with absolute conviction. "But Jack Brennan is going to learn that there are consequences for his actions. I promise you, Victoria, I will not kill him unless he forces my hand, but he is going to answer for what he did tonight." He pulled on his boots, strapped on his gun belt, and walked out into the night before Victoria could say anything else. "Mrs. Fletcher put a gentle arm around Victoria's shoulders and guided her into the parlor, settling her on the sofa with a quilt and a cup of hot tea that Victoria did not remember the woman making. "That man is in love with you," Mrs. Fletcher said matter-of-factly. "I have known Preston Lang for a month now, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." "I am not respectable," Victoria said dully, speaking the truth she had been avoiding. "I work in a saloon, Mrs. Fletcher. I do things that decent women do not do. Preston deserves better than someone like me." Mrs. Fletcher snorted, an inelegant sound that made Victoria look up in surprise. "Respectable," the older woman said with disdain. "Do you know how many respectable women I have known who were rotten to the core? Who gossiped and lied and made other people's lives miserable? Respectability does not make you a good person, child. It just means you are good at hiding who you really are. Preston Lang sees who you really are, and he loves you anyway. That is worth more than all the respectability in the world." Victoria wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that love could be enough, that Preston's good opinion could somehow erase the mark she carried. But she had lived in the world long enough to know that it did not work that way. That society's judgment was harsh and unforgiving, especially toward women who stepped outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable behavior. Preston returned an hour later, his knuckles bruised and bloody, but otherwise unharmed. He had found Jack Brennan stumbling drunk down Main Street and had beaten him thoroughly and efficiently, then dragged him to the sheriff's office and filed charges for assault. The sheriff, a lazy man more interested in keeping the peace than delivering justice, had been reluctant to act until Preston had explained in great detail what he would do if Jack Brennan was not held accountable. The threat of violence from a man who clearly knew how to deliver it had motivated the sheriff wonderfully, and Jack was now cooling off in a cell, awaiting a visit from the circuit judge who would arrive in 2 weeks. "It is done," Preston said simply, sitting down beside Victoria on the sofa. Mrs. Fletcher had tactfully retired upstairs, leaving them alone in the parlor with its homey clutter and warm lamplight. Victoria looked at his damaged hands and felt tears start again. "You are hurt," she said, taking his hands in hers and examining the split knuckles, the bruising that was already starting to darken. "It is nothing," Preston said dismissively. "Victoria, we need to talk." "I know," she said quietly. "Preston, I am so sorry. I never should have let you get involved in my life. You were right when you said Jack would hold a grudge, and now you have made an enemy, and it is all my fault." "Stop," Preston said firmly. "None of this is your fault. Jack Brennan made his own choices, and he is paying the consequences. But that is not what I want to talk about." He took a deep breath, and Victoria saw something like nervousness flicker across his face. "I am in love with you," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I have been in love with you since that first night when you told me about the double R and looked at me like I was a person worth knowing. I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other for a little over a month, but Victoria, I am certain about this. I am certain about you." Victoria's heart felt like it was going to explode out of her chest. "Preston, I am not the woman you think I am," she said desperately. "I have done things, been with men, made choices that I am not proud of. You say you love me, but you love an idea of me, a version that is better and purer than the reality." "I love you," Preston said, his gray eyes locked on hers. "Not an idea, not a fantasy, but you, the real you, the woman who is kind to drunks even when they do not deserve it. The woman who saved her money to bury old Charlie when he drank himself to death last week because no one else would. The woman who reads the newspaper every morning at breakfast and has opinions about the railroad and politics and the future of the territory. That is who I love, Victoria. All of it. The mistakes and the regrets and the survival and the strength, all of it. I work in a saloon," Victoria said, as though he might have forgotten. I am a saloon girl, Preston. Do you understand what that means? It means you have done what you had to do to survive, Preston said. It does not define who you are. It does not define your worth as a person. And it sure as hell does not define how I feel about you. People will talk, Victoria said weakly, running out of arguments. They will say terrible things about you for being with someone like me. Let them talk, Preston said, echoing what he had said weeks ago. He took both of her hands in his, heedless of the pain it must have caused his bruised knuckles. Victoria, I am asking you to take a chance on me. On us. I do not have much to offer right now, just a job that pays decent and a room at a boarding house. But I am a hard worker and I will provide for you. We can leave Rattan if you want, go somewhere no one knows us, start fresh. Or we can stay and build a life here, and to hell with what anyone thinks. I do not care which, as long as we are together. You are worthy of everything, Preston said softly, and the absolute sincerity in his voice broke through the last of Victoria's defenses. Do you hear me? You are worthy of everything good this world has to offer. You are worthy of love and respect and a future that is not defined by your past. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you if you let me. Victoria realized she was crying again, but these tears were different. These were tears of relief, of hope, of the sudden overwhelming realization that maybe, just maybe, she did not have to carry the weight of her shame alone anymore. I love you too, she whispered, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. I have been so afraid to say it, so afraid to feel it, but Preston, I love you so much it scares me. Preston pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, and Victoria could hear his heart beating steady and strong beneath her ear. Do not be scared, he murmured into her hair. I have got you. I am not going anywhere. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped around each other in the quiet parlor, while outside the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. And for the first time in years, Victoria allowed herself to believe that happiness might be possible, that redemption was not just a dream for other people, that she might actually deserve the love this good man was offering her. The next morning, Victoria walked into the Silver Spur Saloon and told Silas Morrow that she was quitting. He was not pleased, but he paid her the wages she was owed without argument, perhaps sensing that arguing would be pointless. She felt lighter as she walked out of the saloon for the last time. As though she had set down a burden she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Preston was waiting for her outside, leaning against the hitching post with his hat tilted back and a smile on his face. How does it feel? He asked as she approached. Terrifying, Victoria admitted. I have no idea what I am going to do now. Well, first you are going to marry me, Preston said, as casually as though he was suggesting they go get breakfast. Then we are going to figure out the rest together. Victoria stopped walking and stared at him. Preston Lang, did you just propose to me on a dusty street outside a saloon? I did, Preston said, straightening up and taking her hands. And before you say I did not do it properly, you are right. Let me try again. To her astonishment, he dropped to one knee right there on Main Street, heedless of the people starting to stare. Victoria Thorne, you are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy, proving to you that you are exactly as wonderful as I think you are. Will you marry me? Victoria was aware of the people watching, the whispers that were already starting to spread. She could imagine what they were saying, the scandal of a respectable cowboy proposing to a saloon girl on a public street. She could imagine the gossip, the judgment, the social consequences. And then she realized with startling clarity that she did not care. Let them talk, let them whisper. Preston loved her and she loved him, and that was the only thing that mattered. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I will marry you." Preston stood and kissed her right there on Main Street, in full view of God and everybody. And Victoria kissed him back with all the love and hope and desperate gratitude that was overflowing in her heart. When they finally broke apart, she was laughing and crying at the same time, and Preston was looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Raton on his way to Las Vegas. It was a simple ceremony in the small church at the edge of town, with Mrs. Fletcher and Raymond Lawson serving as witnesses. Victoria wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Fletcher had helped her sew, and Preston wore his best shirt and the only tie he owned. He looked impossibly handsome, his sandy hair slicked back, his gray eyes shining with emotion as he said his vows. "I, Preston Lang, take you, Victoria Thorne, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you in good times and bad, in sickness and health, for as long as we both shall live. I promise to see you as you truly are, not as the world would label you, and to remind you every single day that you are worthy of everything good." Victoria was crying before she even started her own vows, overcome by the enormity of the moment, the sheer improbability that her life had led her here, to this small church, to this good man who loved her despite everything. "I, Victoria Thorne, take you, Preston Lang, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she managed to say through her tears. "I promise to love you with everything I have, to support you in all your endeavors, and to build a life with you that honors the faith you have shown in me. You have given me hope when I had none, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your love." "You already are," Preston whispered, just before the preacher pronounced them man and wife. They spent their wedding night in Preston's room at Fletcher's boarding house, which Mrs. Fletcher had decorated with wildflowers from her garden, and a new quilt she had sewn herself as a wedding gift. Preston was gentle and patient, conscious of Victoria's past experiences, wanting their first time as husband and wife to be about love and connection, not just physical satisfaction. And it was beautiful, more beautiful than Victoria had thought possible, because it was Preston and he loved her, and that made all the difference. Afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Victoria traced patterns on Preston's bare chest and felt a contentment she had never experienced before. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Where do we go from here?" "Well, I have been thinking about that," Preston said, his fingers combing through her dark hair. "Raymond offered me a foreman position at the Double R. The current foreman is getting old and wants to retire. It would mean more money, enough to build us a house on ranch land. Nothing fancy, but it would be ours." "A house," Victoria repeated, testing out the word. She had never owned anything more than the few possessions she could fit in a single trunk. The idea of a house, a home, seemed almost too wonderful to be real. "A house," Preston confirmed. "With a kitchen where you can cook if you want to, though you certainly do not have to. With a porch where we can sit in the evenings and watch the sun go down. With a bedroom that is just ours, where no one can intrude or judge or make you feel less than you are." "That sounds perfect," Victoria said softly. "Preston, are you sure about this? About me? Because once people know we are married, there is going to be talk. Your reputation will be tied to mine, and that might affect your position at the ranch." "I have already talked to Raymond about it," Preston said. "I told him everything, Victoria, about your past, about the saloon, about why I love you anyway. And you know what he said? He said any man who worked as hard as you have to survive deserves respect, not judgment. He said the ranch would be lucky to have you as the foreman's wife, and that anyone who has a problem with it can take it up with him. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes again, overwhelmed by the support of this man she barely knew. "Why is he being so kind?" she asked. "Because Raymond was a drunk for 10 years after his wife died," Preston said quietly. "He lost everything, his ranch, his reputation, nearly his life. And when he finally got sober, the owner of the Double R gave him a second chance. Raymond has never forgotten what it feels like to be written off by society, and he has made it his mission to give other people the same chance he got. He is a good man, Victoria. You will like him." And she did like him. Raymond Lawson was a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that Victoria appreciated. He welcomed her to the ranch with genuine warmth, introducing her to the other hands and making it clear that she was to be treated with respect. There were a few men who looked at her with speculation or judgment in their eyes, but one hard look from Raymond and those expressions disappeared. Preston was true to his word about building them a house. With the help of some of the ranch hands and supplies from the ranch's stores, he constructed a small but solid cabin on a pretty piece of land near a creek that ran through the property. It had 2 rooms, a main living area with a kitchen corner and a bedroom separated by a simple door. It was not much by most standards, but to Victoria, it was a palace. She spent weeks making it into a home, sewing curtains from fabric she bought at the general store, learning to cook on the cast iron stove Preston had purchased, arranging their few possessions to make the space feel comfortable and lived in. She learned ranch life slowly, figuring out the rhythms of the days and seasons. She learned to recognize the signs of changing weather in the behavior of the cattle, to tell which hands were trustworthy and which needed watching. She learned to ride, something she had never done before, and discovered a love for the freedom of moving across the open land with the wind in her hair and the sky stretching endlessly overhead. But most of all, she learned what it felt like to be loved. Preston was attentive and affectionate, never taking her for granted, always making sure she knew how much she meant to him. He brought her wildflowers he picked on his rides. He read to her in the evenings from books they borrowed from Mrs. Fletcher. He held her when the nightmares came, when the memories of her past life threatened to overwhelm her, whispering reassurances until she could breathe again. They faced challenges, of course. There were people in town who refused to accept Victoria, women who crossed the street to avoid speaking to her, men who looked at her with disdain, or, worse, with the assumption that she was still available for the right price. Preston dealt with the men swiftly and decisively, making it abundantly clear that his wife was off limits and that anyone who disrespected her would answer to him. The women were harder to handle, their social exclusion more subtle but no less painful. But slowly, gradually, Victoria began to build a new reputation. She volunteered to help at church socials, even when some of the women were cold to her. She made friends with the few who were willing to look past her history, women like Mrs. Fletcher and Raymond's sister Sarah, who had come to live with him after her own husband passed. She proved through her actions that she was more than her past, that she was a good wife, a hard worker, a woman of integrity and kindness. The real turning point came in the spring of 1883, when a fever swept through Raton and the surrounding ranches. It hit hard and fast, killing the very young and very old, leaving healthy adults bedridden for weeks. The town's doctor was overwhelmed, barely able to keep up with the sick and dying. Victoria, remembering her experience nursing her mother through consumption, stepped up to help. She moved from house to house, tending to the sick, bringing them food and water, sitting with them through the long, frightening nights. She nursed the wife of the man who owned the general store, spending 3 days at the woman's bedside while Preston took care of their household. When the woman recovered, her husband came to Victoria with tears in his eyes and thanked her for saving his wife's life. She nursed children whose mothers were too sick to care for them, and elderly people who had no one else. She worked tirelessly, barely sleeping, pushing herself to exhaustion because people needed help and she had the skills to provide it. By the time the fever burned itself out 6 weeks later, 12 people had died, but dozens more had survived, many of them because of Victoria's care. The women who had shunned her began to soften, acknowledging that whatever she had been in the past, she had proven herself to be a woman of compassion and courage. Invitations began to arrive, tentative at first, to quilting bees and prayer meetings and social gatherings. Victoria accepted them with grace, never mentioning the previous slights, simply moving forward into the new life she was building. Preston watched all of this with pride and love, marveling at his wife's strength and resilience. "You are amazing," he told her one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and purple. "Do you know that? You are absolutely amazing." "I am just doing what needs to be done," Victoria said, but she was smiling, pleased by his praise. "No," Preston said seriously. "You are changing hearts and minds. You are showing people that redemption is real, that people can grow and change. You are making a difference, Victoria, not just in individual lives, but in how this whole community thinks about grace and second chances." Victoria leaned against him, content and peaceful in a way she had never imagined possible. "I could not have done any of it without you," she said softly. "You gave me the chance to become someone new. You believed in me when I did not believe in myself." "And I always will," Preston promised, kissing the top of her head. "For the rest of our lives, Victoria, I will always believe in you." In the autumn of 1883, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. She was nervous about telling Preston, worried that he might not be ready for a child, but her fears were unfounded. Preston was overjoyed, picking her up and spinning her around their small cabin, laughing with pure happiness. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as though he could not quite believe it. "Victoria, we are going to be parents." The pregnancy was not easy. Victoria was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down, exhausted all the time. Preston was endlessly patient, taking on extra chores around their home, bringing her ginger tea and dry toast, sitting with her when the nausea was at its worst. As her belly grew, he built a cradle from smooth pine wood, sanding it until there were no rough edges that could hurt delicate baby skin. He painted it white and carved their initials and the year into the headboard. Their son was born on a cold February night in 1884, after a long and difficult labor that left Victoria exhausted but triumphant. Preston had stayed with her through the whole thing, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, coaching her through the contractions even though he was clearly terrified. When the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in Victoria's arms, Preston had tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Preston whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "Victoria, he is absolutely perfect." They named him James Raymond Lang, after Preston's father and the man who had given them both a second chance. Little James was a healthy baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and from the moment he was born, he was the center of their world. Preston was a devoted father, taking James on rides around the ranch as soon as he was old enough to sit in front of his father on the saddle, teaching him about cattle and horses and the land they lived on. Victoria sang to their son, told him stories, and instilled in him the values of kindness and respect that she and Preston both held dear. life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Preston's position as foreman was secure, and he was good at his job, respected by the hands he supervised and trusted by the ranch owner. Victoria had become an integral part of the ranch community, organizing social events, helping new wives adjust to ranch life, and continuing to nurse the sick whenever her skills were needed. Their cabin had been expanded with another room for James, and there was talk of building a larger house in a year or two. In the summer of 1885, Victoria gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Louise, after Raymond's sister and Preston's mother. Sarah was a beautiful baby with bright blue eyes that would eventually shift to match her father's gray, and a sunny disposition that made everyone who met her smile. James, now a toddler of 18 months, was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help with her care, bringing her toys and patting her head gently with his small hands. The years passed in a blur of hard work and happiness, challenges and triumphs, the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make up a life. There were difficult times, certainly. Winters were harsh in northern New Mexico, and there were years when money was tight, when the cattle market was bad and they had to scrimp and save. There were illnesses and accidents, the constant worries that come with raising children and making a living from the land. There was still occasional gossip about Victoria's past, whispers that would probably never entirely disappear. But there was also joy, so much joy. There were evenings on the porch with Preston's arm around her shoulders and their children playing in the yard. There were Sunday dinners at Raymond's house with his sister Sarah, and whichever ranch hands had nowhere else to go. There were holidays and birthdays, first steps and first words, the thousand small miracles of watching their children grow. There were quiet moments in the bedroom they shared, where Preston would hold her close and remind her that she was loved, that she was worthy, that she was his whole world. In 1887, they finally built the larger house they had been planning, a proper ranch house with 4 bedrooms and a big kitchen, and a living room large enough to host gatherings. Victoria decorated it with care, making it warm and welcoming, a place where their family could grow and thrive. They filled it with laughter and life, with friends and neighbors, with the rich tapestry of a life well lived. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and learning as much as he loved working with the cattle. Sarah was outgoing and fearless, always getting into mischief, always making people laugh. In 1889, they had a third child, another son they named Thomas Preston, who had his mother's dark eyes and a stubborn streak a mile wide. Victoria sometimes looked at her life and could hardly believe it was real. She had gone from being a saloon girl that people looked down on to being a respected member of the community, a loving wife, a devoted mother. She had a home, a family, a future that stretched before her bright with possibility. And all of it was because of Preston, because he had looked at her and seen not what she was but what she could be, because he had loved her when she did not love herself. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked one evening in the late summer of 1890. They were sitting on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the mountains, the children finally in bed after a long day. He was 43 now, his sandy hair starting to show threads of gray, lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. He was still handsome, still strong, still the best man Victoria had ever known. "I was thinking about how lucky I am," Victoria said, leaning her head on his shoulder. She was 32, and the years had been kind to her, softening some of the hardness that had once been in her eyes, replacing it with the contentment of a woman who knows she is loved. "I was thinking about that night in the saloon when you stood up for me against Jack Brennan. If you had not been there, if you had not cared, my whole life would be different. Our whole life would be different, Preston corrected gently. Victoria, you saved me as much as I saved you. Before I met you, I was drifting, just going through the motions of living without any real purpose or joy. You gave me a reason to stay in one place, to build something lasting. You gave me a family, a home, a life worth living. I am the lucky one. Victoria turned to look at him, this man who had changed everything, and felt her heart swell with love so intense it almost hurt. We are both lucky, she said, and then she kissed him, slow and sweet, tasting the coffee he had been drinking and the peppermint he always chewed after meals. When they finally pulled apart, Preston was smiling, that rare, genuine smile that Victoria had learned to treasure. I love you, he said simply. I have loved you since the moment I met you, and I will love you until the day I die. I love you too, Victoria said, the words as easy and natural now as breathing. Thank you for seeing me, Preston. Thank you for believing I was worthy of everything. You are worthy of everything, Preston said, repeating the words he had said to her so many years ago, the words that had changed her life. You always were, Victoria. I just helped you see it. They sat together on the porch as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Inside the house, their children slept, safe and loved. Around them, the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet, the cattle lowing softly in the distance, the horses nickering in the barn. It was a good life, a peaceful life, built on love and hard work, and the courage to believe that people could change, could grow, could become more than their circumstances dictated. Victoria Thorne Lang, formerly a saloon girl that society had written off as unrespectable, had proven that redemption was possible. She had proven that the past did not have to define the future, and she had found, in the arms of a cowboy who loved her, that she was indeed worthy of everything. The years continued to roll by with the steady certainty of the seasons. James grew tall and thoughtful, eventually attending the territorial school in Las Vegas with plans to become a lawyer, the first in their family to pursue higher education. Sarah married a good man, a young rancher from a neighboring property, and Victoria cried happy tears at her daughter's wedding, remembering her own simple ceremony in the small church in Raton. Thomas, true to his stubborn nature, declared he wanted to be a ranch foreman like his father and worked alongside Preston every day, learning everything the older man could teach him. Preston and Victoria grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They weathered storms, both literal and figurative, supporting each other through grief when Raymond Lawson passed away in 1895, through pride when James graduated from law school, through the bittersweet joy of watching their children build their own lives. They added grandchildren to their family, little ones who called Victoria Granny, and climbed on Preston's lap demanding stories about the old days. In 1900, on their 17th wedding anniversary, Preston took Victoria back to Raton for a special dinner at the hotel that had been built near the railroad depot. The town had grown considerably, with electric lights and a telephone exchange and all the trappings of modern civilization. The Silver Spur Saloon was still there, though under new management, and Victoria looked at it as they passed and felt nothing but gratitude that her life had taken a different path. Over dinner, Preston reached across the table and took her hand. "You have any regrets?" he asked, his gray eyes serious. "About your life, about the choices you have made," Victoria considered the question carefully, as it deserved. "I regret the circumstances that led me to the saloon in the first place," she said honestly. "I regret that I had so few choices, that society offered women like me so little support. But I do not regret meeting you or building this life with you. I do not regret our children or the people we have become. So no, Preston, I do not have regrets, not about the things that truly matter. Good, Preston said, smiling, because I have been thinking about something and I want your opinion. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. The ranch owner is getting old and wants to sell. He has offered me the chance to buy him out, to become the owner instead of just the foreman. It would take everything we have saved and then some, but it would mean security for our family, a legacy to pass on to Thomas and eventually to the grandchildren. Victoria looked at the numbers on the paper, at the financial commitment Preston was proposing, and felt excitement flutter in her chest. "Can we really do this?" she asked. "With hard work and a bit of luck, yes," Preston said. "But I would not do it without your agreement, Victoria. This is our life, our future. It has to be a decision we make together." Victoria thought about the saloon girl she had been, without prospects or hope, and about the woman she had become, a partner in every sense to this remarkable man. She thought about their children and grandchildren, about the legacy of hard work and integrity and love that they were building, and she smiled, squeezing Preston's hand. "Let us do it," she said. "Let us buy the ranch." And they did. The Double R became the Lang Ranch in the spring of 1901. A property spanning thousands of acres with hundreds of head of cattle, and a reputation as one of the best-run operations in northern New Mexico. It was hard work, harder even than foreman duties, but Preston and Victoria tackled it together, just as they had tackled every challenge in their lives. Thomas was invaluable, taking on more and more responsibility as Preston's joints began to ache and his energy waned. James helped with the legal and financial aspects, and Sarah and her husband often pitched in during the busy seasons. Victoria, now in her 40s, finally had the security she had dreamed of in those long-ago days in the saloon. But more importantly, she had love, respect, family, and purpose. She had proven to herself and to the world that a woman's worth was not determined by her past mistakes, but by her character, her choices, and the love she gave and received. On a warm evening in the late summer of 1905, Preston and Victoria sat on the porch of their ranch house, now expanded and improved over the years into a substantial home. They were both in their late 40s, their hair showing gray, their faces lined with the evidence of years spent outdoors. But their love was as strong as ever, perhaps stronger for having weathered so much together. "I have been thinking about that first night we met," Preston said, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Do you remember?" "Of course I remember," Victoria said, smiling at the memory. "You asked for whiskey and treated me like a lady when no one else would." "I saw you," Preston said simply. "I saw who you really were beneath the paint and the dress and the role you had to play to survive, and I fell in love with the woman I saw." "You saved me," Victoria said softly, her eyes bright with emotion. "You gave me a life I never dreamed was possible." "No," Preston said, shaking his head. "You saved yourself, Victoria. You had the courage to believe you were worthy of love, to take a chance on a future that was uncertain and probably frightening. You did the hard work of building a new life, of proving to yourself and everyone else that you were so much more than they thought. I just loved you. That was the easy part." Victoria laughed, a sound full of joy and contentment. "Loving me was the easy part. Preston Lang, you are either a liar or a saint." "Neither," Preston said, pulling her close and kissing her temple. "Just a man who was lucky enough to find the love of his life in a saloon in Raton, New Mexico, and smart enough not to let her go." They sat together as the stars emerged, as they had done countless times over the years. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. Their children and grandchildren were scattered across the territory, living their own lives, but they would all gather soon for Sunday dinner, filling the house with noise and laughter and the chaotic joy of family. Victoria Thorne Lang had been told she was not respectable, had been judged and dismissed and written off by a society that saw only her profession and not her humanity. But Preston Lang had looked at her and said, "You are worthy of everything," and in doing so, he had given her the courage to believe it herself. Together, they had built a life of love and respect, of hard work and integrity, of family and legacy. They had proven that redemption was real, that love could conquer judgment, that two broken people could heal each other and create something whole and beautiful. And on that warm summer evening, sitting on the porch of the ranch they now owned, surrounded by the land they had worked and the life they had built, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that Preston had been right all along. She was worthy of everything. And everything was exactly what she had found. The story of the saloon girl and the cowboy became a legend in their family, passed down through generations as a testament to the power of love and the possibility of redemption. Their great-grandchildren would sit wide-eyed as the story was told, about how their great-grandfather had defended their great-grandmother's honor, about how he had loved her when the world said she was unworthy, about how together they had built an empire from nothing but hard work and faith in each other. But for Preston and Victoria, it was never a legend. It was simply their life, the extraordinary made ordinary through the passage of time and the accumulation of days. They grew old together on their ranch, watching the seasons change, watching their family grow, watching the world transform around them as the 20th century brought automobiles and airplanes and changes they could never have imagined in those early days. Preston passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1923, at the age of 76. Victoria held his hand as he took his last breath, and though her heart broke, she was grateful for the 40 years they had shared, for every moment of love and laughter and partnership. She lived another 12 years after Preston's death, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the matriarch of a large and loving family. When Victoria died in her sleep in the spring of 1935, at the age of 77, she was buried next to Preston in the small cemetery on the ranch property, under a cottonwood tree they had planted together when they first bought the land. Her headstone reads simply, "Victoria Thorne Lang, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, worthy of everything," and indeed she was.